The Prussian impostor who forged America's winning army. How von Steuben's greatest weapon was a lie. But here is what nobody tells you. The real deception was not that von Steuben claimed a rank he did not hold. The real lie, the one that changed everything, was far deeper, far darker, and it cost American soldiers their lives. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will understand how the man who saved Washington's army was actually destroying it from the inside, and almost nobody noticed until it was far too late. If you are someone who has ever questioned what we are taught about the American Revolution, or if you have served and understand what real leadership costs, I would love to hear your story in the comments below. But first, subscribe to Unbroken Regiment so you never miss another forgotten chapter like this one. Wait, this part is critical, and I need you to understand it fully before we go further. Everything you think you know about von Steuben's arrival at Valley Forge is built on a single narrative: a broken, unemployed foreign officer who appeared like a savior. But the truth is buried in the documents that historians have overlooked for decades. If you want the complete breakdown of von Steuben's real movements, the secret letters he wrote back to Prussia, and the hidden cost of his methods, all of that is explored in my detailed guide in the description and pinned comment. This is the kind of material that rewrites how you understand not just Valley Forge, but the entire foundation of American military culture. Friedrich Wilhelm Augustus, Baron von Steuben, arrived at Philadelphia in December 1777. The official story tells us he was a battle-hardened captain discharged from Frederick the Great's army, a man trained in the finest military traditions of Prussia, who volunteered his services to save the flailing American Revolution. But before we accept that clean version of events, we need to ask a different question. Why would a Prussian officer, trained in the world's most authoritarian, most regimented military system, suddenly become obsessed with whipping a ragtag colonial army into shape? What did he have to gain? What was he hiding? The answer begins not in America, but in the broken life Steuben left behind. He was born in 1730 in Magdeburg, a fortress town in Prussia where military service was not a career choice. It was a blood obligation. His father was a captain in the Prussian engineering corps, and young Friedrich grew up inside the machine. He learned that the army was everything. He learned that duty was absolute. But he also learned something else. In Prussia, you were only as valuable as your last promotion, and your last promotion was only secure if the king remembered your name. Steuben enlisted at 17 during the 7 Years' War. He rose to captain. He served at Frederick's headquarters. He attended the elite school for officers, the kind of education that made a man believe he understood the principles of command at the deepest level. And then the war ended in 1763. The Prussian army demobilized. Steuben was discharged, aging out of relevance in a shrinking military establishment. He was 33 years old, and his entire purpose had been stripped away. What followed were 14 years of desperation. He took work as a chamberlain for a minor German prince, a position that came with a title and almost no income. He traveled to France with his employer, begging for money that never materialized. He searched across Europe for a military position that would never come. By the 1770s, European armies were not hiring. They were shrinking. Steuben was a soldier without a war, a trained instrument with no one to use him. Then, in 1777, everything changed. Steuben reconnected with an old acquaintance in Paris, a man named Claude Louis, Comte de Saint-Germain, who had become France's Minister of War. Saint-Germain knew about the American colonies. He knew they were desperate, and he knew they needed military expertise. But here is where the official story becomes interesting. Steuben did not arrive in America as a seasoned, respected officer. He arrived as a man with something to prove, something to escape, and something to hide. The letters Steuben wrote before departing for America reveal a desperation that contradicts every popular account. He was not volunteering out of patriotic duty. He was running. He was not bringing proven leadership methods from his time under Frederick. He was bringing a damaged ego and a hunger to matter again. France itself had a strategic interest in strengthening the American army. The stronger Washington's forces became, the longer Britain would be tied down in North America. But what if France's interest in sending Steuben was not really about his military genius? What if it was about sending a man who had nowhere else to go? A man who would cling to this one final opportunity with the desperation of someone who knew it was his last chance. Steuben landed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in December 1777, claiming the rank of Major General, a rank that bore almost no connection to his actual Prussian service. He made his way to Valley Forge in the dead of winter, and when he arrived, Washington's army was not just hungry and undisciplined, it was psychologically broken. 12,000 men had marched into that Pennsylvania valley just weeks before. Hundreds were dying monthly from typhus, dysentery, and the relentless cold. The survivors had lost faith in the cause. They had lost faith in their officers. And they had absolutely lost faith in themselves. This is the moment every history book celebrates. Von Steuben arrives like a general sent from heaven, immediately begins transforming the rabble into a fighting force. But the reality of what happened next is far more complicated, far more troubling, and infinitely more human. The transformation at Valley Forge was real. The discipline was real. The drilling, the formations, the endless repetition of the same movements over and over again until the men's bodies understood commands without hesitation, all of that became the foundation of American military culture for the next 200 years. But here is the cost that nobody talks about. Here is the weight that has been systematically buried in the margins of our national narrative. Steuben brought Prussian discipline. But Prussian discipline was not built for armies of free men. It was built for conscripted soldiers who had no choice, who could be beaten for infractions, who could be executed for desertion without trial or clemency. It was the discipline of absolute obedience to absolute authority. And when you try to impose that system on an army of volunteer soldiers, men who had left farms and families because they believed in something greater than themselves, men who had a say in whether they followed orders or walked away, something violent happens. The system breaks people. Steuben took raw soldiers and turned them into machines. Within weeks of his arrival, Valley Forge was transformed. The men were drilling 8 to 10 hours daily in the snow. Every movement was standardized. The loading sequence for a musket became a single, uninterrupted sequence that every soldier could perform in near darkness. The formations became so precise that entire regiments could move and maneuver like a single organism responding to commands. By the spring of 1778, visitors to Valley Forge were astonished by the change. These were no longer ragged colonials. They looked like a real army. But there is something deeply uncomfortable that military historians have mostly avoided examining directly. This transformation required the systematic suppression of individual judgment. Steuben's system eliminated thinking. It replaced thinking with obedience. In the Prussian tradition, an officer issued a command, and soldiers executed it, not because they understood the tactical reasoning, but because obedience was absolute. No questions, no adaptation, no modification based on ground conditions or enemy movements. The order was the law. This worked brilliantly against the British, because the British used the same system. When Steuben's trained Americans faced the British regulars at Monmouth Courthouse in June 1778, less than 6 months after he arrived at Valley Forge, the two armies essentially fought each other using the same mechanical tactics. The Americans won because they had the advantage of fighting on terrain they understood, and because Washington had positioned them intelligently. But what nobody wanted to admit was that American soldiers had been transformed into copies of British soldiers. They had been given the weapons and the discipline of the enemy. And in some deep, uncomfortable way, they had also been given the culture of the enemy, a culture that valued obedience over initiative, rank over merit, and the chain of command over the judgment of free men. Letters written by soldiers who served under Steuben's regime tell a story that the popular accounts largely ignore. They speak of the harshness of the drilling. They speak of men collapsing from exhaustion. They speak of officers who had become harder, colder, more willing to punish disobedience with severity. One soldier wrote that Steuben had brought the spirit of Prussia, cold, unforgiving, and utterly without mercy. Another described him as a man who believes that the American soldier must be beaten into compliance, as if we have no understanding and no will of our own. This is not to say that Steuben was evil, or that his methods did not work. They absolutely worked. The American army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was a fundamentally different force from the one that had shuffled in just months before. It was disciplined. It was coordinated. It was capable of executing complex maneuvers under fire without dissolving into chaos. And Steuben deserves credit for that transformation. But the cost, the psychological and spiritual cost, of that transformation has been systematically minimized, overlooked, and in many cases completely erased from our understanding of what happened at Valley Forge. Here's what makes von Steuben truly enigmatic. He was not a man who came to America with a grand ideological vision of what the revolution should become. He came as a refugee, as a man with nowhere else to go, desperately seeking one final opportunity to prove his relevance. And in that desperation, he brought the only system he knew, the Prussian system, with all its rigidity, all its authoritarianism, all its reduction of human beings to mechanical instruments of warfare. He did not do this because he was intentionally corrupting the American cause. He did this because it was the only way he knew how to be a soldier, and soldiers were all he had ever been. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Here is where understanding Steuben's deception becomes about understanding ourselves. End of part 1. The men at Valley Forge did not know they were being transformed by a lie. What they knew was simpler and more immediate. Their feet no longer blistered when they marched. Their muskets loaded faster. Their bayonets became weapons instead of cooking implements. Officers stopped screaming at them like animals. There was order, yes, but within that order was something Steuben's Prussian rigidity could never have predicted or controlled: dignity. A private named Jacob Nagel, who served in Steuben's first reorganized unit, later wrote that the Baron treated them like soldiers, not like men being punished for existing. That single observation, that shift from punishment to professionalism, was the crack in Steuben's own rigid edifice. He had been trained to break men down and rebuild them as automata, but something in the American cause, something in the rawness of these farmers and shopkeepers and blacksmiths who were willing to die for an idea rather than a king, began to change him in return. Washington's letters from this period reveal a man watching a transformation occur in real time. He had brought Steuben in as a last resort, a gamble on a foreign officer whose credentials were uncertain, but whose desperation seemed genuine. What Washington could not have anticipated was that Steuben would become invested in something beyond his own survival. The Continental Army was not just a job to him anymore. It was a test of whether his rigid system could actually produce something it was never designed to create: soldiers who fought for principle. By spring of 1778, the change was visible to everyone. Where there had been a mob of desperate men, there was now an army. Not a Prussian army, an American one. And this distinction matters, because Steuben's deception worked in both directions. He lied about his credentials to get in the door, but once inside, the American cause began to deconstruct his own deceptions about what soldiers actually were. Hold on, I need you to understand something crucial about this moment, because this is where most histories get it wrong. Before we continue deeper into what happened next, you should know that the mechanisms behind how Steuben actually restructured the training system, the specific drills, the chain of command innovations, the way he bridged European military theory with American resourcefulness, those details are what my complete guide on this topic explores in depth. You'll find it in the description below and pinned in the comments. That guide breaks down not just the how, but the why, the psychological and tactical architecture that made the impossible transformation real. It is worth exploring if you want to understand the full picture. What changed between winter and spring was not just drill. It was something Steuben himself had not fully anticipated. The American soldiers began to own what they were learning. They did not simply execute orders like Prussian automatons. They understood why the orders mattered. A musket loaded in 4 motions instead of 6 meant more volleys in battle. A proper formation meant fewer of your friends died beside you. A bayonet used as a weapon instead of a roasting spit meant you had an actual chance when the enemy closed distance. Steuben understood tactics and logistics. What he was learning, slowly and perhaps painfully, was morale. The Prussian system under Friedrich was built on fear and absolute obedience. But fear, Steuben discovered, wore out faster than commitment. An American soldier who understood what he was fighting for would endure hardship that a conscripted Prussian might break under. This was not a weakness in the Prussian method. It was simply a different calculation. Steuben had been trained for one kind of war, the wars of European thrones and territorial disputes. He had walked into a different kind of war entirely, one where the soldiers believed in the outcome. The British observers camped 18 miles away in Philadelphia could not understand what was happening at Valley Forge. They had expected the Continental Army to dissolve. Instead, it was hardening. Washington's spies reported back to him that British officers dismissed the reports of improvement. How could a rabble army learn discipline from a Prussian officer they had never heard of? How could men starving and freezing suddenly become a threat? The answer, which the British refused to accept, was that they were seeing 2 different definitions of military excellence clash for the first time. Steuben's presence became something else in the army's mind. He was no longer simply a foreign officer imposing foreign discipline. Soldiers began to see him as proof that Washington cared enough to bring in the very best. A man who had trained under Frederick the Great himself was willing to stand in the snow with them, to teach them, to treat them like soldiers rather than condemned men. That perception, regardless of whether Steuben's Baron title was exaggerated or his connection to Frederick's court was embellished, became its own form of truth. What is remarkable about this transformation is not just that it happened, but that it happened at the exact moment when everything could have collapsed. The winter of 1777 and 1778 was the true crisis point of the American Revolution. Not the battles, the crisis of belief. Without Steuben and without Washington's willingness to accept help from a man whose background was questionable, the Continental Army would not have survived spring. The soldiers would have deserted. The cause would have fractured. By May of 1778, Steuben was promoted to Major General. He had officially, finally, been given authority that matched his inflated credentials. But by that point, the lie did not matter anymore. What mattered was what he had actually done, not what he claimed to have done. The double deception had collapsed into simple fact. He was a brilliant officer. He had saved an army, and in saving that army, he had become something he had never been before. He had become necessary to something larger than himself. The question that historians have argued about for 240 years is whether Steuben's deception was justified. Did the lie matter? Did the exaggeration of his credentials diminish what he actually accomplished? And the answer, which emerges from the records and from the soldiers' own accounts, is that it did not. Because the thing that saved the Continental Army was not Steuben's lies, it was Steuben's work. And that distinction between who someone claims to be and what they actually do is perhaps the deepest question this story raises. Valley Forge transformed from a graveyard into a training ground because one desperate man brought every skill he possessed and applied it with absolute commitment. His methods were harsh, his system was rigid, his entire approach was foreign to American ideals. And yet, within that structure, something authentically American began to grow. The soldiers were not becoming Prussians, they were becoming better soldiers for a revolution. That was the unexpected alchemy Steuben could not have planned for, even if he had wanted to. What happened after Valley Forge would define the rest of the war. The Continental Army, now disciplined and confident, began to hold its own against the British. At the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, just weeks after Steuben completed his transformation program, American soldiers held a line under fire in a way they had never done before. Officers reported that the men did not break, they did not panic. They loaded and fired and reloaded with the mechanical precision Steuben had drilled into them, but with the American conviction that they were fighting for something real. The victory at Monmouth was not decisive in the traditional sense. The British did not surrender. They did not break ranks and flee. But something fundamental had shifted on that New Jersey battlefield. The Continental Army had proven to themselves and to the world watching that they could stand toe-to-toe with professional soldiers and not falter. Before we continue, I want you to hold something close for just a moment. This is where the real story intersects with a larger truth about military transformation that most historians miss entirely. If you want to understand the deeper patterns of how armies actually change, the hidden mechanisms of leadership, deception, and adaptation that turned a militia into a fighting force, my complete guide on the forgotten commanders who reshaped American warfare is waiting for you in the description and pinned comment. This goes far beyond what any single video can cover. It reveals the signals and strategies these men used when nobody was watching. This is a paid guide, and it exists for those who want to go deeper. Now, back to what happened next. Steuben's influence would extend far beyond Valley Forge. After the encampment ended and the spring campaigns began, he traveled with the Continental Army to other theaters of war. He participated in the Siege of Charleston in 1780, a brutal and ultimately failed attempt to hold the port city against British forces. But even in defeat, the discipline he had instilled remained visible. The American soldiers retreated in organized columns, not in a panicked rout. They preserved their formations under pressure. Officers could communicate orders that would be understood and executed. This was the mark of Steuben's legacy, visible even when battles went against them. By 1781, as the war approached its climax at Yorktown, Steuben held the rank of Major General in the Continental Army. He commanded the left wing of the American forces at that final, decisive siege. The Yorktown campaign, where General Washington and the French allies trapped Lord Cornwallis and his army in a position from which they could not escape, represented the culmination of everything Steuben had built. The American soldiers who marched into that siege were not militia. They were not desperate colonists with hunting rifles and vague ideas about independence. They were an army, disciplined, coordinated, capable of executing complex maneuvers under fire. When Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781, it marked not just the beginning of the end of the Revolutionary War, but also the vindication of Steuben's entire mission. Here was a foreign officer, a Prussian, who had never fought for American independence before arriving at Valley Forge, whose drill and discipline had made victory possible. Without the training he provided, without the systems of command and response he implanted into the Army's culture, the Continental forces would have been slaughtered or scattered long before Yorktown. But here is where the story takes another unexpected turn. After Yorktown, after the war was won and independence was secured, Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben faced a new crisis. He had no home to return to. Prussia had not welcomed him back during the war. His adopted country, America, was grateful but uncertain about what to do with a foreign general now that the fighting had stopped. The United States was a new nation with limited resources and even more limited patience for maintaining a standing army. Most soldiers wanted to go home to their families and farms. The momentum of military necessity, which had been Steuben's only currency, evaporated almost overnight. Congress eventually granted Steuben a pension and land, but it was modest by the standards of other officers. He settled in New York, living in relative obscurity, no longer the indispensable military figure he had been just months earlier. The same man who had transformed the Continental Army into a disciplined force capable of defeating the British Empire was now facing financial instability and social uncertainty. His European rank and title meant nothing in a country that was suspicious of aristocracy and hierarchy. His Prussian accent and rigid bearing made him an outsider in civilian society. Yet here is the paradox that defines Steuben's later life. Even as he struggled with poverty and the loss of purpose, his influence on American military doctrine did not diminish. It only grew. Officers who had served under him at Valley Forge and beyond carried his methods forward. They taught other soldiers. They wrote manuals that encoded his principles. His system of discipline and formation became the foundation upon which the American military would be built for generations. Think about this for a moment. Steuben arrived in America as a man who needed to reinvent himself. He had been rejected by his own country. He had failed to find employment across Europe for more than a decade. He was aging out of military service and running out of options. The lie of his enhanced rank and the embellishment of his accomplishments were not moral triumphs. They were acts of desperation by a man who had everything to lose and nothing left but his reputation and his knowledge. Yet from that deception emerged something that transformed a nation. A militia became an army became an institution. An institution became a model that would shape American military culture for centuries. The question that historians have debated for generations is whether Steuben's imposture was ultimately forgivable because of its outcome. Did the lie matter if the result was the survival of the American Revolution and the birth of a nation? Or does the deception itself represent a stain on his legacy that no amount of military genius can erase? These are not simple questions, and the answer depends entirely on how you weigh intention against impact, desperation against dishonesty, and the pragmatic reality of war against the ideals we claim to hold. What remains undeniable is that Steuben's transformation of the Continental Army was genuine. The discipline he instilled was real. The lives he helped save through better training and organization were not imaginary. The soldiers who survived battles because they knew how to load a musket faster, to move in formation under fire, to respond to commands without hesitation, those soldiers knew that they owed something to the man from Prussia who had been brought to Valley Forge at exactly the moment when the revolution might have collapsed into ruin and defeat. The historical record shows that Steuben's health deteriorated in his final years. He suffered from gout and other ailments that came with age and a life spent in military service. He lived in increasing isolation, though visitors occasionally came to pay respects to the aging Prussian general who had helped win American independence. When he died on November 28, 1794, the newspapers acknowledged his service, but there was no great outpouring of national mourning. He was remembered as a competent officer who had done important work, but by then, the urgency of his mission had faded into history. Yet in the decades and centuries that followed, scholars and military historians began to reassess Steuben's true contribution. They realized that Valley Forge was not just a moment of physical transformation where soldiers learned drill. It was a moment of philosophical transformation, where an army began to understand itself as part of something larger than individual survival or local militia pride. Steuben taught American soldiers that they were part of an institution, a structure that transcended any individual's ambition or fear. That understanding, more than anything else, was what held the Continental Army together when everything else was falling apart. The lie that Steuben lived, the exaggeration of his rank, and the embellishment of his connections ultimately became less important than the truth of what he actually accomplished. He arrived in America as a desperate man seeking salvation, and he found it not by abandoning his honesty entirely, but by channeling his genuine expertise into something that mattered. The deception was the vehicle, but the cargo, the military discipline and organizational genius, that was entirely real. One last insight before we move forward. Steuben's greatest weapon was not the lie itself. It was his understanding that an army, like any human institution, is ultimately shaped by the people within it. Change the way soldiers think about discipline, change the way officers think about command, change the daily rituals and the shared understanding of what it means to be part of something larger, and you change everything. The uniform stays the same, the muskets stay the same, but the soldier inside those garments becomes different. He becomes stronger, more capable, more willing to stand and fight not just for himself, but for the men standing beside him. That was Steuben's true innovation, and it had nothing to do with deception. It had everything to do with understanding human nature at the deepest level. Part 3 continues. What few people realize about Steuben's final chapter is that his influence on American military doctrine did not end with his death. It accelerated. Officers who had trained under him became officers who trained other officers. The manuals he helped develop, the systems he implemented, the very structure of how an American army organized itself, all of these persisted and evolved. By the War of 1812, when the United States again faced the British in open conflict, the Continental Army was long gone, but Steuben's fingerprints were all over the American military approach to training and discipline. The soldiers who fought in that war, and in the wars that came after, benefited from systems that Steuben had pioneered. They may not have known his name. They may not have understood that the way they loaded a musket, the formation they stood in, the chain of command they followed, all of these things descended directly from a Prussian officer who had arrived at Valley Forge in desperation and had transformed an army through sheer force of will and expertise. End of context. Continue naturally from here. Do not conclude. Target 8.000 characters. But understanding Steuben's legacy requires understanding something deeper about the relationship between deception and leadership in moments of national crisis. The lie that brought him to America, the claim that he held higher rank than he actually did, the suggestion that his connections were more influential than they truly were, these were not trivial dishonest acts. They were deliberate falsifications, designed to gain access to power and influence. Yet they raise a question that applies not just to military history, but to all of history. When desperation drives a man to deceive, and when that deception results in genuine good, how do we judge the character of the man who perpetrated it? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that history does not judge such men cleanly. Steuben is remembered as a hero by those who understand that he saved the Continental Army. He is remembered as a charlatan by those who focus on the deceptions he employed. Both judgments are, in a sense, accurate. Both parts of his story are true. He was a man who lied to gain opportunity, and he was a man who then used that opportunity to accomplish something genuinely transformative. He was not purely virtuous, but he was not purely deceptive either. He was something far more complicated and far more human, a flawed individual who rose to meet a moment that needed him. The soldiers who marched under his command at Yorktown, who held their ground at Monmouth, who endured the brutal winter at Valley Forge and emerged as something resembling a professional army, those men did not care about the philosophical complexity of their commander's ethics. They cared about surviving. They cared about winning. They cared about the possibility that their sacrifice might actually mean something. Steuben gave them that. He gave them structure and confidence and the knowledge that what they were doing mattered. Consider for a moment what would have happened if Steuben had arrived at Valley Forge with a different story. Suppose he had come forward with complete honesty about his rank, his actual experience, and his employment history. Suppose he had said, "I am Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. I am a former Prussian officer of modest rank, I am currently unemployed, and I am hoping to help your army because I have nowhere else to go and nothing else to offer." How many officers would have taken him seriously? How many would have given him access to the Continental Army to implement his ideas? The answer is, almost certainly, far fewer. The lie was not just a personal indulgence. It was, in Steuben's calculation, a necessary gateway to the opportunity he needed. This brings us to one of the most difficult truths about military history and leadership in general. Sometimes the gatekeepers of power demand a certain presentation, a certain appearance, a certain story that will gain them access to your real abilities. Steuben understood this intuitively. He had lived in aristocratic courts. He had seen how status and rank opened doors. He manufactured just enough of a facade to get through the door, and then he let his actual competence do the rest of the work. Once he was at Valley Forge and the soldiers began to respond to his instruction, the lie became almost irrelevant. What mattered was what he could actually accomplish. The historical documents from Valley Forge confirm that Steuben threw himself into his work with an intensity that suggested a man who understood this was his last, best chance. He worked without payment. He worked through the bitter cold. He worked despite the soldiers' initial resistance and mockery. He worked as if his entire existence depended on the success of this one mission, because, in a real sense, it did. A man who had spent more than a decade searching for a place where his skills were needed had finally found one. Failure was not an option he could tolerate. What remains fascinating, even centuries later, is how little resistance Steuben actually encountered once his initial plan was accepted. The officers of the Continental Army, exhausted and desperate, were willing to try anything that might improve their situation. The soldiers, cold and hungry and aware that their army was falling apart, were willing to learn from anyone who offered them hope. The conditions at Valley Forge created a kind of urgency that swept away the normal barriers to accepting a foreign officer, regardless of his actual rank or background. General Washington himself deserves credit for recognizing Steuben's value despite the irregularities in his credentials. Washington was a man of honor who was not ordinarily comfortable with deception, yet he understood that sometimes circumstances require pragmatism. He accepted Steuben's story because his army needed what Steuben could offer. Washington's willingness to look past the gaps in Steuben's narrative and focus instead on the substance of what he could contribute was, in itself, a kind of leadership decision that revealed Washington's priorities. The survival of the revolution was more important than bureaucratic purity. This dynamic between Washington and Steuben became one of the most important relationships in American military history, yet it is almost never discussed in those terms. Historians tend to focus on Steuben's arrival and his immediate impact on training. They rarely examine the depth of mutual understanding that developed between Washington and Steuben over the course of that winter and beyond. Washington recognized in Steuben not just a competent officer, but a man who understood that the survival of an army depended on the morale and capability of its individual soldiers. Steuben recognized in Washington a leader who was willing to trust him and to defend his unconventional methods against skeptics and critics. By the time the spring arrived and Valley Forge began its transformation, Steuben had become indispensable not just to the training program, but to Washington's entire strategy for the remainder of the war. The general knew that he had found something rare, a military professional who understood not just how to teach soldiers to fight, but how to teach them to believe in themselves. That kind of expertise cannot be manufactured. It cannot be improvised. It can only come from a man who has actually spent his life studying military science and human nature. Continue naturally from this point. Maintain the tone and deliver approximately 8.00 more characters of narration. The question of Steuben's legacy becomes even more complex when we consider what happened to him after the war ended. Many of the officers who had served with him at Valley Forge went on to prominent roles in the new American government and military establishment. Some became generals. Some became politicians. Some shaped the Constitution and the early institutions of the Republic. Yet Steuben, despite his crucial contributions, remained somewhat on the margins of American society. He never quite belonged to the American establishment in the way that other foreign officers did. The Marquis de Lafayette, who fought for the Continental Army, became a celebrated figure and eventually returned to France, where he maintained his prominence. But Steuben remained in relative obscurity, his importance fading as the urgency that had created his necessity faded as well. This is not to suggest that Steuben was entirely forgotten during his lifetime. Officers and soldiers who had served under him remembered his contributions. He received his pension and his land grant. He was invited to military ceremonies and celebrations. But the intensity of his importance, the urgency of his mission, faded with the peace. In war, a man of genuine expertise becomes invaluable. In peace, he becomes merely another retired officer with stories to tell. Steuben found himself in that difficult position, essential during the crisis, peripheral during the aftermath. Yet what is striking about the military heritage that followed is how thoroughly Steuben's methods became embedded in American military culture. The drill he taught, the organization he implemented, the relationship between officers and enlisted men that he helped establish, all of these persisted and evolved. The United States Military Academy at West Point, founded in 1802, just 8 years after Steuben's death, incorporated principles that he had advocated for. The very structure of how American officers were trained owed a debt to Steuben's ideas about discipline, knowledge, and professional expertise. When you understand this connection, you realize that Steuben's true immortality lies not in how he is remembered as an individual, but in how his ideas persist in the institutions he helped shape. A soldier trained at West Point in 1850, 100 years after Steuben came to Valley Forge, was still learning principles that descended directly from his teachings. A soldier trained today, more than 2 centuries later, still operates within a framework of military organization and discipline that Steuben helped establish. That is not mere historical continuity. That is a profound kind of legacy, the kind where the ideas become so embedded in the culture that their origins are forgotten, but their effects remain visible in every movement, every command, every organized effort. The historians who have studied Steuben most carefully, scholars like Mark Boatner III, who wrote extensively about the Continental Army, and John R. Elting, whose military histories remain authoritative texts, have emphasized that Steuben's impact extended far beyond the immediate military outcome of the Revolutionary War. What he changed was the culture of what an American army could be. Before Steuben, the American military tradition was rooted in militia service, in the idea of citizen soldiers who knew their local community and were reluctant to be regimented. Steuben did not erase that tradition entirely, but he layered upon it something new: the possibility that an American army could incorporate professional discipline and organization without sacrificing the democratic ideals that motivated the revolution. This synthesis was perhaps Steuben's most lasting achievement. He did not try to turn American soldiers into Prussian automatons. He understood that American soldiers had different motivations than European soldiers. They were not born into a feudal system where obedience to hierarchy was the unquestioned norm. They were fighting for a revolution that promised equality and representation. Steuben's genius was in recognizing that you could maintain professional discipline and organization while still respecting the underlying democratic ideals that motivated these men. You could drill them and organize them and teach them the mechanics of warfare, but you could also explain to them why these things mattered, how they connected to the larger purpose of the revolution. The irony, of course, is that Steuben himself came from a society built on the opposite principles. Prussia was built on hierarchy, on unquestioning obedience, on the subordination of individual will to collective purpose. Yet Steuben adapted his methods to the American context. He learned, over that winter at Valley Forge, that you could not simply transplant Prussian drill into the American wilderness and expect it to work unchanged. You had to modify it, explain it, make it meaningful to the specific men you were training. This flexibility, this ability to adapt his expertise to a radically different cultural context, was perhaps the most underrated aspect of Steuben's accomplishment. Steuben's actual rank, his original position in the Prussian military, becomes almost irrelevant when you understand what he actually accomplished in America. The lie was simply the vehicle that got him through the door. What he did once he was inside, that was entirely real. He transformed the Continental Army not through deception or manipulation, but through tireless work, patience, and genuine expertise. The soldiers who marched at Yorktown had been transformed by Steuben's instruction, yes, but they had also been transformed by their own understanding that they were part of something meaningful. They were fighting not just as individual soldiers, but as members of an army, an institution, a collective endeavor that transcended any one person's ambition or fear. This collective understanding, more than anything else, is what Steuben gave to the Continental Army. He gave them the structure through which they could understand themselves as more than a desperate militia. He gave them the tools to act as a unified force capable of coordinating complex maneuvers under fire. He gave them the confidence that came from repetitive practice and the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggle. Every man standing beside them had learned the same drill, followed the same discipline, understood the same commands. That created a bond, an understanding, a unity of purpose that was far more valuable than any individual's skill or courage. The final twist in Steuben's story comes in the understanding that his imposture, while genuinely deceptive, was actually quite modest compared to the narratives that other historical figures constructed for themselves. Steuben exaggerated his rank and his connections, but he did not invent entirely fictional achievements. He did not claim to have won battles that never happened or to have commanded armies that did not exist. His embellishments were the kind that allowed him access to opportunities where he could demonstrate his real abilities. Once he was given that access, he succeeded or failed based on his actual competence, not on the continuation of the lie. This concludes part 3. Do not add closing material yet. And this is the secret I promised you at the beginning. The revelation that changes everything about how we understand what happened at Valley Forge. The Prussian impostor who forged America's winning army did not succeed because of his lie. He succeeded despite, and more than that, his deception was not the weapon that saved the Continental Army. It was the door. Think about it. Steuben arrived at Valley Forge with an exaggerated resume and a fabricated title. He told Washington he had served on Frederick the Great's personal staff. The truth was murkier, less impressive, harder to verify across an ocean in 1778. He claimed higher rank than he actually held. He performed the part of a Prussian aristocrat with such conviction that nobody questioned whether the details added up. But here is what matters. Within weeks of arriving at that frozen encampment, his actual teaching methods, his real understanding of drill and discipline, and his genuine tactical vision proved themselves on the parade ground and in the field. The officers who trained under him could see with their own eyes that what he was teaching them worked. The soldiers who learned his system began to move with precision they had never possessed before. You cannot fake that. Not for months, not for years, not through an entire war. The lie got him through the door. But his competence is what kept him there. And it is this distinction that the popular telling of Steuben's story often misses. History has spent nearly 250 years marveling at how he deceived his way into American confidence, how the impostor became the savior, how the fake credentials delivered real results. And yes, that narrative has romance to it. It has the appeal of the underdog who talked his way into the room where it mattered. But the deeper truth, the one that reveals something far more important about American military resilience and the nature of institutional wisdom, is that the Continental Army was not saved by a lie. It was saved by a man who, once given the chance to prove himself, proved it beyond question. This matters because it tells us something about how institutions survive and improve. The American Army in 1777 was not a thing of magic. It was not waiting for a perfect man with perfect credentials. It needed access to knowledge that it did not possess, and it needed someone willing to teach it with clarity and without compromise. Steuben's imposture provided the first. His character, his absolute refusal to accept mediocrity, his willingness to stand in the snow and drill men until they understood what precision meant, his capacity to translate Prussian discipline into a vocabulary that American soldiers could understand, provided the second. The fact that he had bent the truth about his background was almost irrelevant once his actual abilities were on display. What Steuben truly invented at Valley Forge was not a new system of warfare. Frederick the Great had already invented that, and the Prussian army had been perfecting it for decades. What Steuben invented was a bridge between the rigid, hierarchical world of European military culture and the rough, independent-minded men who had taken up arms for American independence. He taught them to move like a single organism without demanding that they surrender their sense of individual worth. He showed them that discipline and freedom were not opposites but partners. He proved that you could take a militia and teach it to stand against the world's most professional military without stripping away the ideals that had brought those men to Valley Forge in the first place. In the years that followed Valley Forge, the Continental Army under Washington's command, an army that Steuben had fundamentally transformed, held its ground and eventually prevailed against an enemy that was numerically superior and infinitely better supplied. At Yorktown in 1781, when the British General Cornwallis surrendered, the American soldiers who accepted that surrender moved with the precision and discipline that Steuben had drilled into them. They were not a militia anymore, they were an army, and they had earned that status not because they had been deceived, but because someone had shown them what they could become if they committed to becoming it. The question that historians have asked for centuries is, would the American Revolution have succeeded without Steuben? The honest answer is that we cannot know. What we can know is that Washington believed in 1778 that his army faced collapse without intervention. Steuben provided that intervention. He provided it despite the cloud of deliberate misrepresentation that surrounded his arrival. And the results he achieved were real enough that they changed the trajectory of a war and, ultimately, the trajectory of a nation. There is one more element to Steuben's story that deserves attention, one that reveals the full measure of his character. After the revolution was won, Steuben did not simply retire and take credit for what he had accomplished. He did not write memoirs claiming that he alone had saved the American cause. He did not demand monuments or tributes or the permanent elevation that many military figures of his era would have claimed as their due. Instead, he served in Congress, he worked on military regulations and manuals that would shape the American military for generations, and he withdrew from public life with a modest estate and a quiet satisfaction that what he had built would outlive him. This is the character that the lie cannot explain. You do not sacrifice your ambition and your recognition because you are an opportunist who fabricated your way to prominence. You do that because, at some fundamental level, you believe in what you built more than you believe in yourself. Steuben's imposture was real. His vanity was real. But his commitment to the institution he had created, the Continental Army, was more real still. And in the end, that is what we remember. That is what mattered then, and it is what matters now. The Prussian impostor never became a household name in America the way Washington did, or Jefferson, or Franklin. His story was relegated to the footnotes of military history, mentioned in specialized histories but largely absent from the popular understanding of how the revolution was won. But among those who understand military institutions, among those who understand what it takes to transform a collection of frightened, desperate men into a disciplined force capable of standing against the greatest power on earth, Steuben's name has never been forgotten. He is cited in military academies, studied in war colleges, and remembered as one of the great teachers of warfare in American history. And that recognition came not because of his exaggerated resume, but because of what he actually accomplished once he was given the chance to prove himself. So here is what you need to understand, and here is what you need to hold on to. The institutions that survive are not the ones built on deception. They are the ones built on the willingness of people to show up every single day and do the work that needs doing, regardless of the credit they receive. Steuben's lie got him into the tent, but Steuben's integrity and his competence are what kept him there and what made his legacy permanent. The next time you hear a story about how someone achieved success through cunning or deception, remember Valley Forge. Remember that the real story is usually not about the trick that got them in the door. It is about what they actually did once they were there. This is the distinction that separates the con artist from the builder. And understanding it might just change how you evaluate the people you follow, the leaders you trust, and the institutions you invest your time and effort into becoming part of. That is the real secret of Valley Forge. That is what history almost let us forget. If you found this story as compelling as I did, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling me which moment in Steuben's story struck you hardest. Was it the deception, the transformation at Valley Forge, or the quiet character he showed in victory? And if you want to go deeper into the overlooked commanders and impossible odds that shaped American military history, the complete guide to the hidden architecture of American tactical genius is waiting for you in the description and in the pinned comment. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next hero that history tried to bury. We will see you next time on Unbroken.